In the movie Child's Play, a children's doll hosts the soul of a cold-blooded killer. And after invading the home of single mother Karen and her son Andy, the doll begins carrying out acts of vengeance against those who wronged him while he was still alive. But will Andy be framed for these violent acts? Or will Chucky get to him first? On today's video, we're going to be talking about the film Child's Play, and I'm going to decide whether I think it's a movie to be remembered or a movie to forget.
Stars and Stripes.
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another I mean the 36th. So I imagine most people don't really need an introduction for the killer doll known as Chucky. Even though these movies came out a while ago, he's kind of been stapled into the horror zeitgeist for forever now. But what's really interesting to me is that most people who are familiar with Chucky know him as a comedic horror icon. I think when a lot of people think of the character, the first thing that comes to mind is comedy, and the second thing that comes to mind is bad comedy, and the third thing that comes to mind is... Seriously, does anybody really find Chucky funny? Anyway, I just don't think that Chucky represents terror as much as he did at the beginning of his franchise because of the later entries in his series. And yes, really quickly, I do know that there was a recent remake of the original Child's Play movie that tried to bring Chucky back to his roots. As much as I really want to talk about the new movie, we're just going to focus on the original 1988 Child's Play film. And something that's great about the original film that doesn't quite fall in line with its sequels is that the antagonist is treated as a legitimate threat that is feared instead of just being a punchline. Now, other horror icons have gone through a very similar transformation over their franchise's run. Freddy Krueger is an example of an antagonist who really does become more comedic as the films go on, but in my opinion, comedy was always in Krueger's DNA, even from the first entry in the series. Even if the comedy wasn't as exaggerated in the original film, the original Nightmare on Elm Street had comedy in it. At best, Freddy Krueger telling a joke is a twisted way of telling you he enjoys or is indifferent to your suffering. And at worst, the comedy becomes hilarious and is so bad it's good. So with that in mind, it's so odd to me that comedy is what Chucky became known for, because in my opinion, that part of his character is added in future films with very little basis in the original movie. And if we're talking about reasons why this film should be remembered, one of the best examples is that Chucky is a legitimate threat. And the fear and horror he represents in this movie is very unique compared to other stories that try to tackle the same subject. Anyway, let's talk about the events of the film. So the movie starts with a pretty intense shootout leading to a confrontation in a local toy store. Charles Lee Ray is a career criminal who has been abandoned by his partners and is now being chased by a homicide detective, Mike Norris. And after Norris lands some fatal hits on Charles Lee Ray, the desperate and furious criminal vows to kill Norris and his former partners no matter what. Knocking over a stack of good guys dolls, with his last words, he chants in a different language, and as he does this, lightning hits the store, destroying it. So I love this opening scene, especially when Charles Lee Ray, who also goes by the nickname Chucky, just starts chanting magic words randomly. But I do think that the lightning transferring his soul into the doll is a little cliche, and the exploding of the store is just excess. I mean, come on, there's no need for all of that. This is supposed to be a slasher movie. I just have a feeling that starting the movie with a big explosion kind of sets you up for the wrong film. But having a serial killer bleed out over a bunch of toys, chanting words that the audience doesn't understand yet, that alone sets the tone perfectly for the rest of the film. Then we go on to meet Andy on the morning of his birthday, as he preciously makes breakfast for his mother Karen. And he does this all by himself? Jeez, parents in the 80s needed to watch their kids better. We learn more about the Good Guys toy line and how difficult it is for Andy's mom to afford one given her job. And would you look at how they used the budget to really make this Good Guys toy feel like it was real? Not only do you get animated commercials, but you get a guy in a costume in a live-action TV show. I love how much of the budget is put into making the Good Guys toy line feel real. The cartoon, and not to mention the quality of the toys and the boxes that they come in, really sell that this doll is real. There's just a level of commitment to the in-story canon that I really don't see in other movies. This stuff might not last long on screen, so it might seem like a waste of time to certain filmmakers, but I can't say enough how much this stuff sticks with you subconsciously. Even if you know who Chucky is, I would argue that there's a point in the film where you start to doubt whether there's actually a killer inside of the doll. And that has to do with the fact that the movie has convinced you that the doll is real, making you forget the character that is now famous. But sadly for Karen, this doll is very real. Anyway, Karen has the unfortunate pleasure of finding someone who is selling a Good Guys doll in her price range. And it just so happens that this person is a bum who discovered the doll after the toy store exploded. Later, after Karen's close friend and coworker mysteriously dies when babysitting Andy, the once happy family's life begins to descend into darkness. Police arrive on the scene, and Detective Norris from the beginning of the film begins to suspect that the death of Karen's friend wasn't actually an accident, but a murder. And when he finds footprints at the scene too small to be that of an adult's, he begins to suspect Andy. Karen believes her son isn't a killer, but her faith is shaken when Andy begins to explain that his doll was the killer responsible for the footsteps found at the scene of the crime. But while Karen begins to grapple with the bizarre reality that Andy could be telling the truth, the real horror of this film begins to reveal itself. In my opinion, one of the scariest parts of Child's Play is the simple concept that this child has unmoderated access with a full-grown adult, let alone an adult who is a violent killer. I think the scene that perfectly represents this fear is when Andy just regurgitates something awful and horrible that Chucky told him.
He said that Maggie was a real bitch and got what she deserved.
Andy, how can you say something so horrible?
I didn't say it, Chucky did.
Now, Andy is a sweet young boy. He is, fresh into this world. He doesn't even know what he just said. The added horror of like a full-grown adult, especially a serial killer, having unlimited conversational access to your child is the fact that this person is taking the form of a children's toy, and a toy that this child worships. They spend a lot of time at the beginning of the movie getting across that, this kid loves this toy and this franchise.
Chucky's been talking to you too, hasn't he? What's he been saying?
All kinds of things. His real name is Charles Lee Ray, and he's been sent down from heaven by Daddy to play with me.
And so even if this kid did have the wherewithal to be like, that doesn't sound right, you shouldn't be talking to me like this, I would argue that the ability to make those kinds of judgment calls would be erased because as a kid, he worships the idea of this doll. And it's not strange to him that it talks because they always talk. These dolls always talk. I think they put a lot of work in the early parts of the movie to really make it clear that this doll can say anything to this kid, and this doll has a huge amount of influence on him because the kid loves these types of dolls and these types of toys. Who knows, maybe if Charles possessed a different doll, he wouldn't have as much sway over Andy. But the chilling fact is, he does have sway, and Andy essentially will do whatever he wants. So I've actually been watching The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix, as I'm sure many of you are, and don't worry if you haven't watched it, I'm not going to spoil anything major. But what I think is interesting is that there are elements of this concept in Bly Manor. At multiple times throughout the season, an adult character is depicted abusing the trust earned with a child in an attempt to achieve their personal goals. And these manipulative conversations are never really complicated because you don't need to say very much to deceive a child. The formative years in a person's life is a very precious and vital time, and the idea that someone is corrupting a child as a byproduct of trying to achieve their own goals is honestly disturbing to me. The intention in both examples is not to harm these children, but they just don't care enough about them to realize they're doing any real harm. And because Karen doesn't believe that Chucky is sentient, he essentially has unlimited access to Andy. But luckily for Andy, Karen does eventually discover the true nature of this insidious toy. But not before Andy is taken by police for further psychological evaluation because of the odd nature of his stories. And after her son is taken, Karen decides to interrogate the doll, choosing to trust the testimony of her son, even if what she was doing felt absolutely crazy. Now, this scene is very compelling, and it feels like it represents the main theme of the film. That theme being the lengths of unconditional parental love. Karen is a single mom, and she has unconditional love for her son. Karen choosing to believe that the insane story that her son's toy is alive and is potentially hurting people is not easy for her to do at all. It is a huge personal sacrifice for her to believe her son's stories, especially because at this point, she doesn't have any real proof of anything supernatural. This is a complete leap of faith. She trusts her son because she loves her son. And I feel like that's a really beautiful message in this movie that doesn't get a lot of attention, and honestly that I don't really see this genuine in other films. But her following through and deciding to believe her son, even if it is crazy, is what makes it so compelling. But sadly, the confrontation goes as expected when the good guy's doll simply recites one of the 3 iconic lines the doll is famous for when prompted to speak by Karen. Karen, now defeated, retreats to the kitchen to weep before noticing something that changes everything. She discovers that the batteries that were included in the box were never put inside of the doll. This, of course, meaning that the toy has been talking without anything to power it this whole time. And also a clever little nod to the original title of the film, Batteries Not Included. With this, Karen once again decides to confront the doll, which refuses to out itself until she threatens to set it on fire. After making this threat, the tone of the scene changes completely, and it changes to a goofy scene where an actor is clearly flailing around a doll in an attempt to convince the audience that it's alive. So now that the cat's out of the bag, Chucky is revealed to be alive, and he can go around and do whatever he wants. But unfortunately, there are a lot of scenes like this, where the doll attack isn't very intimidating. That being said, after you've watched several scenes of the doll flailing around all silly, it's really scary when you see this. There are visual effects in the movie that convey the doll moving very human-like, either by tricking the shot by filming an actor portraying Chucky from a distance, or by using stop motion, not to mention the numerous animatronics that were used. When I was rewatching this movie, I was genuinely creeped out when I saw him move like this for the first time. When I saw him attack Karen, I assumed that that was the limits of the film's special effects budget, and that Chucky's mobility was extremely limited. But in actuality, he moves a lot in this movie. And while I'm sure it wasn't intentional, I would argue that the less impressive scenes featuring Chucky help lower your expectations, allowing the more sophisticated special effects to have a greater effect on you when they defy the logic you've come to understand in the film. Essentially, you're expecting to see Chucky move in a certain way until he doesn't. And if I'm being honest, I do prefer the more sophisticated scenes, and I wished all of Chucky's scenes looked that way, because, you know, watching an actor play with a doll is lame. But I do think it's worth noting that I might be more creeped out by the former because of the existence of the latter. Anyway, now Karen is aware that Chucky is alive, and she's trying desperately to find him before Andy does. And why is Chucky looking for Andy? Well, that's because Charles Lee Ray, the man who possesses the good guy's doll, paid a visit to his old friend John Bishop, although I don't think John considers Charles a friend. You see, Chucky makes it very clear John Bishop, aka Dr. Death, was the one who taught Chucky how to transfer his soul into an inanimate object. But after Chucky sustained a wound that caused his toy body to bleed, he begins to wonder why this is, because part of the appeal of being a doll was not being able to die. So I'm not gonna lie, as much as I do love the voodoo aspect of this film, it is a little weird to see Chucky playing with a voodoo doll.
Your own personal mojo, Doc.
Give me that.
Like, I do really love this scene where he mangles John Bishop's body with a voodoo doll, but there is a part of me that feels like it's hard to buy into the terror in this scene, because it's kind of like a hat on a hat at that point, you know what I mean? Because at that point, you're watching a serial killer ghost possessing a life-sized child doll who is using a voodoo doll to break the limbs of their former mentor. There's just a lot. There's just too much. I feel like that's too many hats. You can wear a couple hats. It's just too many. And so I feel like while I'm willing to cut it some slack and be like, okay, this is kind of cool, I feel like most viewers are going to be like, that's their jumping the shark moment. Like, I can buy that Chucky was made via voodoo powers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I want Chucky using a voodoo doll. I'd also like to really quickly talk about the voodoo that's introduced in the film. In my opinion, and from my observation, voodoo is kind of used as shorthand in a lot of horror and just Western media in general to say that it's basically just bad magic. Whenever you hear voodoo or hear about, voodoo practices, you immediately know that there's a big issue. In a lot of films, they don't even need to explain what went wrong. They just need to explain that somebody used voodoo, and clearly that was a big issue. Now, I'm fine with voodoo being used as a horror element in movies or it being something scary in your fiction, because I think there are plenty of other horror films that feature different faiths as the source of horror. So I think it's okay. I just think the volume of voodoo stories that are about it being evil is disproportionate. And so something I really like about this movie is that when John Bishop, aka Dr. Death, who was the person who taught Chucky how to practice voodoo and change his body from flesh to doll.
What?
When he is introduced, he is not introduced as like an evil character. He even clarifies that voodoo is not the problem, but that it's actually Chucky, the serial killer, who twisted this magic for evil purposes.
Because you're an abomination. An outrage against nature. You perverted everything I've taught you and used it for evil, and you have to be stopped.
I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting, and it actually made me very happy that John Bishop was not portrayed as an evil person. If anything, he was portrayed as a victim as well, before he had his arms and legs broken. Because he seemed like somebody who did not teach Chucky willingly. He seemed like somebody who had no choice but to teach him how to use voodoo because Chucky was a criminal, an intimidating, evil criminal that death couldn't even stop. So again, I just really like that they didn't make John Bishop an evil character and that they didn't demonize voodoo in this movie. The true evil is people. The human who uses that voodoo is the problem, not the magic itself. It's a take I rarely see in stories featuring voodoo. Also, check out Dr. Voodoo. He's a Marvel superhero and he's pretty dope. Another one of my favorite scenes from this movie is when Karen visits the household of the former killer known as Chucky. And when she crosses the threshold into Chucky's old living space, she discovers a very strange and bizarre looking room, with the walls decorated with unfamiliar paintings and the furniture being somewhat otherworldly. I'm a really big fan of visual spectacle and visual horror. If I'm being honest, a lot of the artwork on these walls and in this room are actually quite beautiful and fascinating. But what makes them strange and horrifying is the fact that you really don't expect this movie to take this turn. In my opinion, one of many keys to horror is the unexpected. Boo. Gotcha. Gotcha. You were totally just gotcha. Alright, anyway. And this scene is just so out of place compared to the other scenes that came previous. This is when Karen is finally starting to believe her son, and more importantly, starting to believe something that's completely insane. That a killer is possessing the body of a doll. And they visually represent this new world and thought process that Karen is entering by having her literally enter into a room that she is unfamiliar with. It's just one of those things where Karen and the audience don't really know what they're looking at. The movie has trained us at this point to expect, Western suburbia, or at the worst, a killer giant action figure. But the mural in this room and the furniture are just so different than everything that's already been presented. It just creates this moment in both Karen and the viewer of, I don't know where I am or what's happening. And I just really admire that form of scare, that kind of alienating scare. After Chucky tortures John Bishop, he discovers that his body is turning more human because the longer his soul remains in an inanimate object, the more human it will become. So John explains that Chucky only has a certain amount of time to transfer his soul into a human body, or else he'll be trapped in the body of a doll forever. But why Andy? Well, the reason Chucky is looking for Andy is because he can't just transfer his soul into any person's body. He must instead transfer his soul into the body of the person Chucky first revealed his new body to. Does that make sense? No, wait a second. Let me try that again. Chucky's looking for Andy because he can't just transfer his soul into any person's body. He must instead transfer his soul into the body of the person who he first revealed his new body to. Why am I not getting this? Wait, so the body of the transfer of the body of the person who saw him has to be the person of the body.
He has to
Charles
soul transfer,
move his
who
soul
saw him
into the body
move
of
the body.
Okay. Stop. So this is one of the weirder parts of the movie because it's a complete contrivance. The film needs Andy and Karen to be in danger at the hands of Chucky, but since he was released from their apartment, there's no reason to clash with him anymore. So we're given a magic reason why Chucky needs to track down Andy, which is weird because I feel like you don't need to contrive a reason. Maybe Chucky just doesn't want a police officer and a mother and child to know that a serial killer is alive in the body of a doll. Even if people won't believe them, maybe it's better to tie up that loose end. But instead, they go with the magic excuse. It's like, as John is explaining why Chucky needs Andy, you can start to see the plot device in this motivation. I like to call this moment when the skeleton is revealed, when you as a viewer start to understand that this scene is not in service of the characters, but instead it's contriving a service for the plot. And so all you see is how the machine works, instead of all of the emotion and compassion and motivation that makes a film compelling. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely one of the weaker parts of the movie. So now that Chucky has his new goal, and now that everybody important knows that Andy's doll is really a killer, the climax of the film begins. For the adults, it's a race back to Karen's apartment, and Andy must defend himself from his former toy. And let's be honest, Andy doesn't really stand a chance.
Please don't leave me. Please.
Yikes. So I feel like I have a difficult relationship with child actors. It's hard for me to put into words, but I think the idea that encompasses how I feel about this is just, I don't think there should be professional children anything. And so the idea of having professional child actors, it rubs me the wrong way. Now, I know that there are rules and there are regulations to protect these children, and that makes me really happy. But it's scenes like this that really make me question what this kind of performance does to you at that age. Like, I always wonder whenever I see children in any horror movie next to corpses or being screamed at by, a killer, what are they thinking? Like, were they introduced to this concept in a way that makes sense for fictional purposes?
The biggest thing that comes to mind as well is that I was afraid of Chucky when I was this child's age. So what's the difference between me and him at that time, right?
I don't know. Anyway, this scene is amazing. Like, if he's acting, if he's just a really great actor at that age, I guess that's really awesome because that is a really good performance. But as soon as I watched that performance, I was very worried about how real it was. But I did do research and I didn't find that this actor had any issues in the future, at least publicly. In fact, he seems to be somebody who is very fond of his role in the Child's Play franchise as an adult. Looking at his Wikipedia page, he's been in almost all of the Chucky films. So I have to assume that, he likes these movies to some degree or feels positively about them in some way if he keeps returning to them. Anyway, hopping off my soapbox again. Sorry I'm ranting. Didn't mean to. Just wanted to talk about kids getting killed in movies. I'm sorry I talked so long. Just before Chucky completes the ritual to transfer his soul into Andy's body, Detective Norris and Karen arrive to stop him. The three struggle to stop Chucky as their attacks chip away more and more of the doll's body, revealing a menacing and disturbing new appearance for the killer. And while that is awesome, this starts to make me question if what John Bishop said was true. Wasn't Chucky afraid of dying in the body of a doll because he bled? I guess you could argue that Chucky is more worried about being stuck as a doll than being killed as one. Maybe I got the wrong impression, but this motivation expressed earlier by John kind of contradicts with the climax of the film, in my opinion. Either way, I'm glad that they chose to make the decision to tear apart Chucky visually. It's really awesome and increasingly frightening seeing just how inhuman Charles Lee Ray has become in his new body. It's a really tense climax that causes you to question if Chucky can ever be stopped, let alone die. But eventually, the killer doll is destroyed, and after his final attack on one of Detective Norris's skeptical coworkers, the film ends with this interaction.
You believe me now? Yeah? But who's gonna believe me?
I love this dialogue, and I think it's a great way to end a film that struggle was built around characters believing each other. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you believe this story, because it's going to be impossible to convince everyone around you. Andy was lucky that he had the love of his mother to give him the benefit of the doubt. But as for Detective Norris and his partner, they needed evidence, and they needed to see to believe. And it is not going to be easy to convince the other police officers and other people to see what you saw in this apartment when Chucky attacked. Anyway, I really love this dialogue. Like I said, I think it just makes sense. And with all that said, is Child's Play a movie to remember? In my opinion, yes. I think the original Child's Play film stands out from its future and more popular sequels by creating unique scenarios that aim to terrify instead of make you laugh. I also think that the story of Chucky, for its time, is a very clever and natural progression of the killer doll subgenre of horror. From Twilight Zone to Goosebumps, this story has been seen many times, but while Child's Play introduces voodoo to its canon, I think what distinguishes it the most from its contemporaries is the fact that it focuses on the vile nature of humanity. I think seeing the killer doll trope take the shape of a desperate criminal was a breath of fresh air for the subgenre. And though I mocked some of the visual effects in the movie, I do think that overall, the effects are very impressive and unsettling. In the final act especially, the visual effects can be viewed as sophisticated even to this day. I also really loved the performances in the film, even if some of them made me feel like certain actors were actually in danger. I think the greatest strength of the actors in this movie is portraying a sense of earnestness that I rarely get to see in horror movies. Sure, Karen is afraid of a killer doll, but her priority is to protect her child at any cost, and that focus is never lost. But of course, it's important to note for horror fans that just because the focus is on Karen and her son, that doesn't mean that we lose focus of Chucky at any point. I mean, this movie is fun in an old school, over-the-top horror way, but not everybody felt joy at the release of this film. Shortly after the release of Child's Play, many people protested the release of the film, claiming that it would lead children to become more violent. While I disagree with that sentiment, I do admire the movie for causing enough of a ruckus to garner such outrage. Outrage that definitely is worth remembering. So yes, with all of that said, I do think that the original Child's Play film is a movie to remember. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If for whatever reason you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. If you've been watching my videos this month, you know that it is Creepy Carrot Month, which is my silly name for October. So while I've been trying to do more scary or creepy YouTube videos this month, I've been putting most of my attention to Twitch. On Twitch, I'm playing only horror games, and our main objective is to play as many Resident Evil games as possible. So if that sounds interesting to you and you want to watch me play video games live, check me out on Twitch at carrotscraps. And all my other social media, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram is carrotscraps as well. I want to thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Dear everybody, how do I sound? How do I sound? How do I sound? So Chucky was going to the store, and then he ate a dog.